How do you think the war continues to affect the Vietnamese American community today?
There are many ways that I think we are affected by the war, and some of those are biological too. And so I did conduct a literature review on the mental health among Vietnamese Americans, and what I kind of found is that we have these shared histories that created shared reactions in our brains, these epigenetic changes that get passed down from generation to generation. It kind of all revolves around intergenerational trauma, I think, that still affects us all. I mean, some may find that they have a more heightened fight or flight response directly as a result of the previous generation being involved in wartime. And you also have these um, post-traumatic stress disorders that are prevalent in adults today because they experience a lot of things directly as a result of that war. I think it's just created this environment where I think with most Asian communities, there is this stigma against mental illnesses, but because of the Vietnam War, Vietnamese American communities are actually very much more predisposed to mental illness, depression, and anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. We are predisposed for all of those issues. I think we end up with this like negative feedback loop or positive feedback loop actually, where we have these issues, but we also have stigmas that play into them as a result of cultural development over years and centuries versus the actual epigenetic responses of just a few recent generations. I think that's really interesting to kind of think about. It is sad that like we have these strains between generations within our community, but at the same time, that is just a result of going through something as traumatic as living through a war that has displaced so many of your people and created these ethnoburbs and ethnic enclaves where your community gathers as a result. Um, and so on that side, you have these literal, you have these areas where the Vietnamese community gathered once they all immigrated because that is just the natural tendency of an ethnic community to do so. But you also have these mental issues that have stemmed as a result that sometimes go untreated, that kind of exacerbate stigmas because as mental illness becomes more prevalent, the stigma against it becomes greater and more acknowledged because I think in Vietnamese culture, it is kind of considered a karmic a retribution that if you are challenged by mental health, then you have done something to deserve this in a past life. Which is obviously not the case, but there are so few words to describe it in Vietnamese, other than I think literally being called crazy. And that just causes a divide between generations as you become more, I guess, Americanized, you become more accepting of mental health as well, just because of the nature of America's culture, which does lead to the idea that maybe what we sacrifice between generations is not entirely cultural, but trying to mix other parts of our culture, create a kind of dichotomy where you create a straw man's argument that maybe this mental health is an American issue, when really it's just that American side being able to acknowledge it more. And that is one part where the Vietnam War still affects us today in a roundabout way. It's because we are kind of a different person now. We are Vietnamese American, and we are both. We are both Vietnamese and American, not one or the other. And that's just something that I think with any ethnic community that immigrates, it's something to try and acknowledge and definitely plays a part in these generational divides that can affect how you perceive one generation from another. And I think like that's also made worse, like the divide is made worse just by how the Vietnam War is discussed in America. And it's really, it's a tragedy because there are so many sides that to the Vietnam War that you don't really get taught to you. You have the immigrants directly from the war who kind of are of the idea that they lost their homeland. And so their side is just very biased, very against the current government. But you don't really get any nuance from that because, I mean, you wouldn't expect them to have to face the nuance. They lost their homes and they lost almost everything coming to America. You can't really begrudge them the fact that they hold a grudge still against the government, right? But then at the same time in Vietnam, of course, they're not teaching those nuances just because it is obviously a communist regime now. But then in America, because of American involvement in the Vietnam War, you get a very biased perspective on the fact that it was a proxy war, that it is between the communists and the capitalists. You have that idea that it is solely about these differing ideologies, when in reality, it was definitely a multi-pronged war. It was economic, it was social, and it was civil. And so it was more than just communists versus capitalists. There were people in the South who were not communists at all, but put their lot in with Ho Chi Minh because Ngo Dinh Diem was a horrible president and he was very self-serving, right? You have these people joining guerrilla forces and all that just in the attempt to be on the winning side, not out of any ideological desire. And you have these stories of people who were forced to fight, even coming into contact with American squads, and both of them just deciding not to shoot each other. There is a very large history, actually, of soldiers in the Vietnam War refusing to fight on all sides just because it was a war that had elevated beyond the actual goals of reuniting Vietnam. I mean, the Americans were drafted into the war. They didn't even sometimes know what they were fighting for, right? And so you have all this differing perspective that you kind of get to absorb more being in America. As a second generation, you have the opportunity to actually see these different sides more. But it's really hard to bring this up with the first generation because the first generation is kind of their set opinions, and you don't want to change their mind because they kind of have suffered so much they deserve to have that uh single-mindedness. But at the same time, you get so little in the second generation who have a desire to learn about the war that you're starting to lose the fact that it was very nuanced. A lot of people are no longer aware of the nuances or aware about the war at all, and not many of them express a willingness to learn. And so, in a way, the Vietnam War does affect us in many ways, but it is dying out in its relevance just because, just as a product of what it was.